Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is NURFITRIAH FAJRIATUL MASULA. I'm from TBI 1 and my ID number is T2019-6038. In here, I would like to share my knowledge and my understanding of Chapter 2 about the translation theory before the 20th century of Monday's book. Okay, now, the main focus of this chapter is the central recurring theme of word-for-word and sense-for-sense translation, a debate that has dominated much of translation theory. And the focus will be on a selection of the most influential writings from the history of translations. This includes Cicero, Saint Jerome, Dolet, Luther, Dryden, Tytler, and Schleiermacher. The reason for choosing these particular writings is the influence they have exerted on the history of translation theory and research. Okay, now, what is word-for-word or sense-for-sense? Up until the second half of the 20th century, translation theory seemed locked to a sterile debate over the triad of literal, free, and faithful translation. The distinction between word-for-word or literal and sense-for-sense or free translations goes back to Cicero, the 1st century BCE, and Saint Jerome, the late 4th century, and forms the basis of key writings on translation. Okay, the next one is about faithfulness, spirit, and truth. Flora Amos, in her early theories of translation, 1920, notes that early translators often diverged considerably in the meaning they gave to terms such as faithfulness, accuracy, and even the word translation itself. For example, Lewis Kelly in The True Interpreter, 1979, looks in detail at the history of translation theory and traces this history of what he calls the inextricably tangled terms fidelity, spirit, and truth. The concept of fidelity, the faithful interpreter, had initially been dismissed as literal word-for-word translation by Horace. Indeed, it was not until the end of the 17th century that fidelity really came to be identified with faithfulness to the meaning rather than the words of the author as described by Horace. Kelly, 1979, describes spirit as similarly having two meanings, creative energy or inspirations, proper to literature. It is easy to see how in the translation of sacred texts, where the words of God is paramount, there has been such an interconnection of fidelity to both the words and the perceived sense, spirits, or the energy of the words and the Holy Spirit, and truth, or the content. Okay, the next one is the theory of John Dryden. A very free approach to translation produced a reaction, notably from another English poet and translator, John Dryden, whose description of the translation process would have enormous impact on subsequent translation theory and practice. Dryden reduces all translation to three categories. The first is metaphors, word-by-word and line-by-line translation, which corresponds to literal translation. The second is paraphrase, translation with latitude, where the author is kept in view by the translator, so as never to be lost, but his words are not so strictly followed as his sense. This involves more or less faithful or sense-for-sense translation. And the third is imitation, forsaking both words and sense. This corresponds to Cowley's very free translation and is more or less adaptation. Dryden thus prefers paraphrase, advising that metaphors and imitation be avoided. The next is the theory of Etienne Dolet. Other writers on translation also began to state their principles in a similarly prescriptive fashion. One of the first had been Etienne Dolit. He set out 5 principles in order of importance as follows. The first one is the translator must perfectly understand the sense and material of the original author, although he should feel free to clarify obscurities. The second is the translator should have a perfect knowledge of both SL and TL so as not to be lessen the majesty of the language. The third is the translator should avoid word-for-word renderings. And the fourth is the translator should avoid Latinate and unusual forms. And the last one is the translator should assemble and liaise words eloquently to avoid clumsiness. Here again, the concern is to reproduce the sense and to avoid word-for-word translation, but the stress on eloquent and naturality form was rooted in a desire to reinforce the structure and independence of the new vernacular French language. Okay, the next one is theory of titler. In English, perhaps the first systematic study of translation after Dryden is Alexander Fraser Tytler's essay on the principles of translation, 1797. Rather than Dryden's author-oriented description, Tytler defines a good translation in TL reader-oriented terms to be that in which the merit of the original work is so completely transposed into another language as to be as distinctly apprehended and as strongly felt by a native of the country to which that language belongs as it is by those who speak the language of the original work. Tytler has 3 general laws or rules. The first is the translation should give a complete transcript of the ideas of the original work. The second is the style and manner of writing should be of the same character with that of the original. And the third is the translation should have all the ease of the original composition. Tytler himself recognizes that the first 2 laws represent the 2 widely different opinions about translation. They can be seen as the poles of faithfulness of content and faithfulness of forms, or even reformulations of the sense for sense and word for word diet of Cicero and Saint Jerome. Okay, the last one is the theory of Schleiermacher and the valorization of the foreign. In 1813, the German theologian and translator Friedrich Schleiermacher wrote a highly influential treatise on translation, on the different methods of translating. Schleiermacher is recognized as the founder of modern Protestant theology and of modern hermeneutics, a romantic approach to interpretation based not on absolute truth but on the individual's inner feeling and understanding. Schleiermacher first distinguishes 2 different types of translator working on 2 different types of texts. These are: the first is the Dolmetscher, who translates commercial texts, and the second is the Übersetzer, who works on scholarly and artistic texts. The real question, according to Schleiermacher, is how to bring the ST writer and the TT reader together. So, he moves beyond the issues of word for word and sense for sense, literal, faithful, and free translation, and considers there to be only 2 paths open for the true translator. Either the translator leaves the writer in peace as much as possible and moves the reader toward him, or he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the writer toward him. Schleiermacher, 1813 until 1992. Schleiermacher's preferred strategy is the first, moving the reader towards the writer. Okay, that's all that I could say. I apologize if I made some mistake. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.